was working for the FBI back in, well, right out of high school, graduated in '64. Went up to Washington with some friends of mine, and we worked for the Bureau for a year. And I was taking a couple of courses at night at a local college, so I had enough hours so the draft board would stay away from me. And then they changed the policy, and you had to go full-time and take 12 hours or more to be exempt. And so I lost my exemption, and then I knew it wouldn't be long until they came after me. So I went down and saw some recruiters, looked at all the different services, ended up volunteering for the Army. My brother had been in the Army, he'd been airborne, and I joined, and I selected administration. I tested high and wanted to go into something that would probably not be direct combat related. It didn't work out too well, but I went into postal operations and Fort Benjamin Harrison, Indiana. They used to call that Uncle Ben's Rest Home, and I graduated as a postal clerk and went to a movie with a friend one day on post, and they had this big advertisement. Would you like to be an officer? Go down to building 4375 and take the test. So I went down and I took the test, and I passed the test, and I went to artillery OCS, and so basically a year, almost a year after I'd gotten those orders to go to Japan as a postal clerk, I ended up going to Vietnam. I graduated from artillery OCS, went to Fort Polk, Louisiana, where I was a training officer, and a few of us artillery lieutenants saw a DA circular, and we were talking about that DA circular, and we volunteered for the big guns over in Vietnam, the 8-inch 175 howitzers, and we thought that would be, if you have to go to Vietnam, you might as well be 15 to 20 miles back with the big guns, and so we thought we'd be relatively safe, but get good experience and be able to, and not be directly assigned. We wanted to control our assignment somewhat. Got to Vietnam, spent 6 months with the big guns. We were in the rear area. It was relatively safe. This was before the first big Tet offensive. I went over in June of '67. And because a bunch of us had come over at the same time, they wanted to trade us around to other units so we wouldn't all leave at the same time. And so I was traded to a direct support 105 artillery unit, and I reported, and the first question they asked me was, have you been a forward observer? And I said no, and so they told me to report the next morning, and I'd fly out and join my unit. So I ended up with Alpha Company, 1st of the 6th Infantry, and this was out at LZ Chippewa, and it was a great outfit, and we saw a little bit of action around the Chu Lai area. Nothing really significant, no major battles or anything like that. And I had gotten used to firing artillery. I used to put us to bed every night with bringing in rounds close so we'd be nice and secure in the event we were attacked and things of that nature. And then we had, so I really became part of the command group. I didn't know a lot of people with the company. They had come over together. They had trained together for a year and a half. They all knew each other very well. And I did become well acquainted with Captain Brennan, of course, company commander. Worked with next to him every day. Several of the NCOs who were in the command group I knew well. Mostly Joe Piccarelli, who was became friends with him, and Joe was killed in May of '68, and that death was probably we went through a lot of combat, but that death was the hardest thing for me in Vietnam, was losing him. We had so that's how I got to Vietnam and how I got to the unit, and I served with the unit from January of '68 until almost the 1st of May of '68. And then I went to their parent headquarters, which was still in the field, and I was their artillery liaison officer, and I was supporting the artillery guys from all of the companies in the 1st to the 6th, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie company, and Delta. And we were out on LZ Center, and there was a lot of action in that area. And surprisingly, the company and the battalion lost more men in May of '68 over the month than they did at Lo Giang, the big battle in February, where we had so many killed and wounded. We had we were actually back at a base camp in the rear area. The 1st to the 6th Infantry, and specifically Alpha Company, but the whole brigade was the jump brigade, jump battalion for the Americal Division. So the 1st to the 6th Infantry was designated to go to any trouble spot, and they were the first to be deployed. They were having problems with the Tet Offensive. We had lost, of course, we lost Way, we lost a lot of bases that were out in the not near the major population areas. We even had problems in the major population areas, and there was a lot of concern that they might lose the Da Nang Air Base, which was a critical facility for fighting the war in the I Corps in northern Vietnam. And it was imperative that the enemy not overrun that position. So Westmoreland basically made a decision to move elements of the Americal Division in to support the Marines at Da Nang. The Marines at Da Nang, the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force, was the command group, and in fact was the command and control group for the Americal Division. But they didn't like to mix forces. They didn't like the Army and Marines fighting in the same area, because we had difficulty communicating, difficulty with support activities. It's not like it is now with good joint forces operations, and so they didn't call on the Americal Division, but Westmoreland basically forced the issue, and so they called us together. We knew there was an alert. It moved so fast, we didn't have any maps. We didn't know where we were going. We got on choppers with a basic load of ammunition. So we basically flew up to this Marine Corps base with no knowledge of what we were going to do. When we got off the helicopters up there, I stayed with Captain Brennan, close to him, and he was trying to get information from the Marines on where are your forces, where are we going to operate, what's the mission. The Marine Corps commander on the base really didn't know. He knew we were coming, and he didn't know how we were going to be used. They finally figured out that we needed to be a blocking force and make sure that nothing happened to the airfield. Brennan got on the line and got the Americal Division supplies to just start flooding that base with ammunition and equipment, and the Marines were a little shocked to see all this stuff coming. And we on the 7th, we got in there and started to get dark, but we had to move out and put ourselves in position. So we marched from that camp up the railroad tracks, which paralleled Route 1, up towards Da Nang. And when we got to a little river right below Da Nang, we turned to the right and went out towards the ocean, maybe not even half a mile, and around the village of Lo Giang. And we camped that night. Well, really, we got there about 2 o'clock in the morning, and then we got up around 6 in the morning, so we didn't get much rest. But it was right there south of Da Nang, probably less than 2 miles from the Da Nang airstrip. And we positioned ourselves along the river by the graveyard, and basically in a big line heading east and west, and paralleling the river, and we were and that's how we got into into position. What happened then was it was the morning. It was very interesting because we did finally get maps. We knew where we were. We didn't know where the enemy was. We didn't know exactly what was happening. And then an old man came running from the village, and the villagers were pouring out of the village of Lo Giang off to our east. And old man came over and he says, "Buku VC, Buku VC," and I wasn't quick enough to write down 100, 200, 300, because he would have understood that, because then he would have told us there were like 500 or 600. We had no idea. We thought that there were maybe a bunch of VC in the village, but we had no idea who was there, and we had no idea it was the North Vietnamese Army, it wasn't Viet Cong. It was an NVA brigade, and it was a seasoned fighting unit, and their mission was to overrun the airfield. And so we were put in as a blocking force to help protect that. We decided to, Captain Brennan decided that we were going to move on the village, and he was fairly cautious, which was good. He had another tour in Vietnam. He had previously been there, and that probably saved a lot of lives in the end. We were online, and if you can view this on the east side, more towards the ocean, was the 2nd platoon, and on the mountainside on the right side of this formation moving south, our formation was moving south. On the left side, or the east side, was the 2nd platoon. On our right side, moving towards the village, or a little to the west, we had the 3rd platoon. The command group was in the middle. We were right in between the 2nd and 3rd platoon. And then behind us, the 1st platoon was a few, about 100 yards, 150 yards back in reserve. And then remaining at the rear area where we had camped and where all our gear was the mortar platoon. As we were lining up to go across the field, and this was probably 500 or 600 meters of open rice paddy and towards a tree line, which was the village, I fired a couple of artillery rounds in to adjust them, to get targets in case we needed them. And about that time, which was around, I think, 10 in the morning, I saw a bunch of artillery fire or mortar fire about 1,000 meters off to our right. And turns out I really didn't know for 35 years later that was a group of Marines who were going in to help a Marine base that was in that village, a little civic action platoon group, CAP group, and it was called CAP Echo 4. It was CAP, Civil Action or Civil Assistance, platoon or whatever it was, and then it was with their Echo company, and it was number 4. So CAP Echo 4 was the group. They actually had a little base in that village. That village was, they knew everybody there. They worked with them for years. They were there to make sure that the village was, supported the government. Everything was secure for the village. And there were 15 of these Marines, and they were in a truck. And as they got close to the village, they got mortared and attacked, and overran by several hundred North Vietnamese soldiers. We couldn't see that well. We couldn't see around the corner of the trees. I could see the fire going on, the mortars going in. I thought it was our guys. I thought it was Charlie Company who was over in that area, and I thought they were firing into that area. And turns out these 15 Marines were all killed or captured. One of them became a prisoner of war. the commander of the group, the lieutenant, told them not to send anybody else in there, that they were being overrun. We never got that word. We never knew they were under attack. They never communicated, the Marines never communicated with us that anything was going on. And so it was, that particular Marine lieutenant had, so the last thing he said was, "Tell my wife I love her." That one gets me every time. Because it was really sad. It was sad that he knew he was going to die. He didn't want anybody else to come in there. He knew it was a trap. He knew they were overwhelmed. He said there were hundreds of them, and don't send anybody else in there. We never got that word. And we had, so we were lining up going into the village, and as we moved across the field, it was kind of interesting because we really didn't know what we were going to run into. I think if we did, we would have fired a lot of artillery into that village. We would have brought in airstrikes. We would have softened the target. We would never have gone in wide open. And to Brennan's credit, what he did as we moved across the field was that he stopped us about 100 meters short of the tree line. And he had us get down and lay down a base of fire, which is basically the 2nd platoon and the 3rd platoon opening up fire and emptying a magazine of ammunition, just a flood of fire into the tree line. They stopped, and then but the noise didn't stop, and it turned out that it sounded like it was louder coming back from the tree line than it was us firing into the tree line. And the 2nd platoon, who was off to our left, was really trapped. They were in a they came very, very close to a group of North Vietnamese that were in a trench line that we didn't know was there, and they came out of that trench line and engaged the 2nd platoon. They came out of the tree line and engaged the 3rd platoon. When there was a helicopter in the area that could provide some gunship support, and we popped smoke along the line in order to, so they could see where we were, so they could fire into the trees and not fire into us. And what happened was we started getting mortar rounds around our smoke rounds because they knew we were where we're at, so they started mortaring that. And Brennan then ordered a withdrawal. He wanted people to pull back to the 1st platoon so that we could dig in and figure out what was going on and then bring in air support. He had been in some major battles in his first tour in Vietnam, and he wasn't going to get the company all trapped. As it turned out, the 2nd platoon, virtually everyone was killed or wounded in the 2nd platoon. A couple of guys got out without, only I think 2 or 3 got out without being wounded. The 3rd platoon, a lot of guys were wounded, a couple killed in the 3rd platoon. And in the command group, myself and a recon sergeant that I had with me were the only people in the command group that didn't get killed or wounded. And the guy who carried my radio operator, was shot in the arm, and rounds went through the radio. And so I was out there really trapped because I didn't have a way to communicate to call in artillery fire. And every time we stuck our heads up above the rice, which was just a few feet high, all kinds of rounds would go off and around us. And so I stripped the radio off of him and encouraged him to try to, and pulled on him and started dragging him back towards the rear area. Must have taken us an hour to drag him back. At times he wanted to give up. He was brand new. I didn't even know him. Don't know his name. Can't remember his name. He had been in country about 2 weeks. He had reported to us the day before. I have no idea who the guy's name is. Still haven't been able to find it out. But he had a little girl about 2 weeks before, just as he was leaving. He left country and the girl was born. So, he hadn't seen her. So every time he'd try to give up, I'd tell him he's got to see his little girl, that kind of stuff. And pull him on, encourage him, and he and I felt really bad. I didn't want to leave him, and I was really conflicted because I needed to get to a radio, and I needed to call in artillery fire. And then I heard the artillery fire coming in, so I figured somebody else had gotten the back in the rear, and it turned out that Brennan had got to a radio, and my recon sergeant had gotten to the rear, and he got on that radio and was calling in fire, and that was good. But it took me almost an hour to drive that guy back, and if I hadn't drug him back, he wouldn't have lived. That area was fully overrun by the enemy, and what I did was, after I got back to the rear, for the last 50 yards of that, I got him up and we walked in, and I held him, and then he got taken care of. I pulled the bullet out of his arm. It was halfway out anyhow, and stuck it in his pocket when the medic came to clean the wound. And I said, "Don't let them take that away from you. Make sure you take that home." And the bullet went in, hit his arm, broke his bones in his upper arm, and then popped back out. And when I got back to the rear, I went over to Captain Brennan. He was white as a ghost. He had been wounded. He had lost a lot of blood. He was still trying to command the company, and he was in control, but he looked like death warmed over. And